Hi, thank you. Get my timer here as well, since my colleagues did such an excellent job of keeping to their time. Thank you very much to the Watson Institute, and especially to Glenn for inviting me. This is really a pleasure. And very much thanks to my colleagues for being here. It's just an honor to be on this panel with them. I have a little bit of data I want to show you. And so if I can find the slideshow button. There we go. I'm a political scientist. We like charts and figures. We learned that from economists, actually. And so I just want to show you a few things that I think will highlight, I hope, and explain my reactions to Glenn's piece. And let me first say that I very much agree with one particular aspect of Glenn's argument. And that is that the fixation on policing is deeply misguided. That is not to say that the protests against policing were incorrect or wrong in some way, but that organizing and ordering a social justice movement around the policing problem, or even for that matter, mass incarceration, I think is unlikely to have the kinds of outcomes that those of us who care about these issues are interested in. And so I very much agree that this focus on police and sort of the non-recognition of problems of order and violence in amongst African Americans and within African American communities is problematic. On the other hand, I very much agree with my colleagues that I'm troubled by the way race and sort of the history of racial hierarchy and the persistence of white supremacy in the United States drops out, or seems to me anyway to drop out of the spirit of Glenn's argument. And I'm also worried about the discussions of character and responsibility in the context of what I call racialized state failure in American politics. And what I'd like to do is offer maybe a kind of broader lens for the discussion that might, I hope, provide some firmer ground for the kinds of broader scope that I think Glenn really aims to get at, and that my colleagues certainly raised in their comments. And this broader frame is what I refer to as racialized state failure. And I see it as a way of drawing together some very serious, long-standing failures of the American state to make good on the democratic promise and the promise of prosperity for African Americans. And I want to focus on just two aspects of state failure, which are the main aspects of state failure, which have to do with security from violence and security from the state violence, that is. And so I just want to show you a couple images and a couple of charts and try to make sense out of this for you. And my slides here are, I've done the cardinal sin of PowerPoint, which is probably to have some text on slides, too much text on a slide. But it's as much to focus myself as you, because the argument's a little bit complicated, so I hope I can make sense of it for you here today. I worry a little bit to some extent that Glenn's piece falls into a narrative that bifurcates or sort of dichotomizes things a bit in the way Tricia explained. One is the thing that we heard a lot from conservative talk shows, which is the redirection of public discourse to black-on-black crime, right? So you get these media images and conservative talk show, radio talk show, and television talk show hosts saying, everyone's talking about policing, but really let's talk about the real problem of black victimization, which is coming from other blacks. And then even some African American groups focus on this as well. I was at a Martin Luther King Day event in Newark, New Jersey, in Wickwak High School. You can probably pronounce that for me. Weequahic, thank you. Which is an African American, largely, almost exclusively African American high school, where all the talk was on stopping so-called black-on-black crime. And the racial liberal, or sort of the racial progressive response to this typically is to highlight the fact that black-on-black crime is a nonsensical term when you consider the fact that virtually all crime is intra-racial, right? People tend to commit crime against people of the same racial group. But in doing so, racial liberals tend to want to bracket the crime conversation away from the policing conversation. And this is something that I do think Glenn doesn't want to do, and I agree with him. And I think doing that, I think bracketing the police violence conversation from what I call the street violence conversation is a mistake. And I think it's a mistake for a number of reasons. First, it reinforces the idea that the primary tool for ameliorating racial inequality on justice issues is to further constrain the state, to further rein in the state from its abusive practices. But in doing that, we obscure the larger causes of racial equality, which I think Tricia very much alluded to, which have to do with the failure of the state to act affirmatively to successfully protect African Americans to the same degree as white Americans from early death. So understanding the link between the disproportionate exposure of African Americans to state violence and to murder reveals a far more tragic reality than I think the singular focus on policing suggests. And I read Glenn to be trying to draw in these other realities. And I refer to this as the racialized failure of the American state. Now, my colleagues in comparative politics would object to this term. State failure is a term we apply to undeveloped countries, not rich democracies like the United States. But what I want to say is that a lot of what my colleagues are describing is really the lack of involvement of a state in the African American community, with the exception of policing and prisons. And that the response to the vast array of disparities and inequalities that have been produced and reproduced by the American state for African Americans are responded to with a kind of muscular criminal justice state at the expense of this wide range of other state options that have been available to white Americans. So how serious is this state failure? Well, let me just give you a couple of slides. Many of you are probably familiar with this slide, which is the imprisonment rates. The United States, way above everybody else by far, not even close. It's off the charts, right beyond the pale, several times, multiple times higher than our democratic cousins in Europe. I've just put a few on here. We're familiar probably with some of the work by Bruce Western on lifetime risk of imprisonment, right? And we certainly know that African Americans, especially males, are dramatically more likely to experience imprisonment than white Americans. What we're less familiar with is homicide rates and the deep exposure of African Americans to violent victimization that white Americans are by far more insulated from. So this is just an overall graph, but what I want to just call your attention to is to notice that in the United States, the lowest violence years are higher than the highest violence years of the next most violent country of rich democracies, which is Canada. So our lowest homicide rates are about 4 per 100,000. Canada's peak homicide rates were 3 per 100,000. So we are off the charts with respect to lethal violence. Now, not surprisingly, we're off the charts with respect to lethal violence generally, but particularly when it comes to African Americans. Now, this is race and gender, homicide rates by race and gender. And what you see is a shocking and horrifying exposure of lethal violence, of African American males to lethal violence that dwarfs every other race-gender combination. Moreover, if you look carefully, you also see that African American females, which is this line, are victimized by murder at a rate higher than white males, which is quite extraordinary when you look at homicide data around the globe. Homicide is by and large a male-on-male phenomenon. And it is remarkable that the exposure of African American women to homicide goes largely unremarked upon. And it's one of the reasons why I object to the fixation on policing and imprisonment, because it leaves us with this gendered account of racial inequality, because it talks about the effect of all of these institutions on African American males and neglects the deep suffering of African American women. But notice the African American male rates, which are extraordinarily high. And at their worst, approach homicide rates in some of the more violent countries in the world. So places where we are cognizant of people being unsafe. That's the kind of exposure that African American males experience in the United States. And if we look at this in a different way, and I want to actually, let me just do this before I detail it a little bit more. Understanding homicide risk by rate per 100,000 is quite difficult, because nobody knows 100,000 people. But if we think about life risk, and this is a very kind of heuristic, it's not a great tool because it holds constant homicide rates, which of course you can see fluctuate a great deal. But just to give you an idea of how serious this problem is, if you take a homicide rate at a given year, and you imagine somebody living a 75-year lifetime with that level of homicide, what lifetime risk does is calculate the odds of being a victim of murder. And if we look again at the gender race differences, you are not misreading, it's not a typo. At the height of the violent crime wave in the United States, if you were born in 1980 or 1994 as an African American male, and the homicide rate had remained that high for your entire lifetime, 1 in 20 African American males, excuse me, could expect to be murdered, which is a stunning and remarkable and tragic statistic. We also see African American females, as you noted before, a much higher risk than white males, and white females whose life risk of homicide, even at their peak, come closer, much closer to the kinds of European protection from homicide that we're used to hearing about in the news, right? The sort of halcyon Scandinavian countries where nobody ever killed anybody. They're still higher, by the way. American homicide rates are higher than European homicide rates, even when you remove the exceptionally high rates for African Americans. And I just have one last thing down here because, again, it just shows you the shocking reality here. If you took an African American male in 1994 between 18 and 24, and if you somehow magically stayed 18 and 20 to 24 for your whole life, which would be a tragedy itself, and lived your whole life with the risk of homicide at that age, because that was the single highest homicide rate and the single most victimized demographic group, your life risk of homicide would be 1 in 8. 1 in 8. So when we think about policing, you can begin to see why I want to talk about something so much broader. And as I say, I read Glenn to be wanting to do that as well, and I hope that this is offering us some kind of framework. So what I refer to as racialized state failure has to do with the risk of violence as a first-order political problem, no matter the source, whether the source is from other people, whether the source is from the state, whether the source is from one's racial group or another racial group. And I can tell you of 20 years of working in the politics of crime and justice, all citizens have the expectation that the state will ameliorate these risks. All citizens, regardless of race or class, and as was highlighted so nicely earlier, the expectation that middle-class white Americans have is certainly that if there's a risk, they will be protected by the state in one way or another. And if the laws don't protect them sufficiently, they will have the laws changed. So all citizens expect the state to do something about violence. It's the core state obligation and the essence of statehood, the hallmark of the modern state. Unfortunately, this fixation on state violence, as I say, I think obscures this vastly greater risk of early death for African Americans from a wide range of sources. And I don't have time to go into more detail, but we could look at many, many social risks, from unemployment to injury to infant mortality to health to just about every social risk you can imagine. Social risks which, by the way, modern democracies have managed to insulate many of their citizens from. And white Americans enjoy much of that insulation as well from those risks, and African Americans do not. And I'm running out of time, so let me see. I have 2 minutes. So I guess I will jump to my conclusion, which is that I take Glenn to be saying that, of course, limited and fair application of the use of force by police is a crucial component of the democratic state. But by focusing only on that dimension of the state, we miss the larger role that the state plays in insulating the polity from risk. If African Americans constituted a distinct nation, the economic, social, and political conditions in which many live would be characterized as evidence of an ineffective state, one that leaves its citizens unnecessarily exposed to the kinds of risks that modern democratic states have very effectively reduced. So I would like to invoke the Black Lives Matter phrase, Glenn, but Black Lives Matter, I guess I want to conclude, and the American state has failed and continues to fail to offer the same security of modern statehood for African Americans that white Americans enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.